Oh, well, I don't know how that happened, but
let me make you a
attendee.
co-host.
Yeah. Can you make him a co-host?
Oh,
Oh, there we are.
can.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello, Mehmet.
Do you need?
Hello.
Do you need to show? Are you going to show slides or anything? Or
Yeah. Yep, I'm
okay.
gonna show.
So we
You
need to
are a
make him
co-host now, so you are already a co. Oh no. Let me.
Okay.
Do, yeah.
I think I can do it using share screen, right?
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today, and
Thank you very much for inviting me.
yes, so you're in Almaty, right?
Yeah, I'm in Almaty. Mm-hmm.
I see.
Excellent. Okay.
What's the weather? What's the weather is in Almaty right
Today
now?
it is nice. Indeed, today nice. Yeah. Yesterday it was rainy. I don't know. I haven't gone outside, but it seems today it is like maybe 15 degrees something.
Oh, I see. It's also nice weather in Nur-Sultan at last.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
It's been, the snow has melted in the last week from
Okay,
basically
great.
yeah, now we have almost spring. Yeah. So
I guess it may take another couple of weeks until all the snow will melt. So it's too much snow still.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, we have 1 minute.
So yeah, we'll start in a minute or two where people are starting to join, so that's good. So are you going to go to Washington D.C. for this postdoc at all, or will you stay here in Almaty?
I mean, I was supposed to go there, but due to the current situation, I couldn't go there, so I preferred staying here. Yeah. Indeed, my fellowship is ending quite soon, in just 2 weeks. So yeah.
Oh, it's just a year, right?
It is just a 3 months fellowship. It's not a postdoc.
Oh, I see. I used to, a long time ago, I used to work at the Wilson Center as a research assistant. Anyway, it's a nice place. So
yeah.
All right. Okay, shall we, Nikolai, do you want to start, or do you want to wait a few more minutes?
I think it's already 3 p.m., so we have to start. And first, maybe Curtis, you will present our speaker, and then we can start the talk. Okay,
I think that's good. All right, well, welcome everybody. This is the third talk in our Eurasian Speakers series. I'm Curtis Murphy, Assistant Professor in History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies, and my colleague Nikolai Tsirimpilov, Associate Professor also in History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. And we're both pleased to introduce Mehmet Volkan Kaşıkçı, who is currently a postdoc at the Woodrow Wilson Center, though he is now in Almaty. In 2020, he defended his dissertation at Arizona State University. And today he is going to talk to us about remembering and experiencing the Kazakh famine. So I'm just going to turn it over to Mehmet, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Hi everyone, once more, thank you very much for inviting me. I guess I can share my screen right now. Oh, I cannot do it right now. Only host who can share, only host it says.
Let me.
Okay, now I can do it.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, hi everyone once more. Making sense of catastrophe, experiencing and remembering the Kazakh famine. This is currently my Kennan Institute project. It started as a chapter of my dissertation. I first would like to introduce my dissertation, chapters in my dissertation. So I was initially I was interested in the fate of orphans of the famine. I mean, what happened to these orphans after 1933? This was my main question, and I was very eager to write a collective biography of these orphans because I thought it was a perfect case study to discuss Sovietization. However, unfortunately, it was impossible to write such to conduct such a research due to the lack of sources. Then I turned my dissertation into a more broader study of childhood with different chapters, like imagining. My dissertation is entitled "Imagining Growing Up Soviet in the Periphery, Imagining, Experiencing, and Remembering Childhood in Kazakhstan in the Age of Stalin." So I had a chapter on the Kazakh famine, but I first thought it was going to be only a descriptive chapter because I was more interested in chapter 3 here, Orphans of Famine, and I was not aware actually that there are so many famine testimonies, so many memoirs here. For this reason, I started with an archival research, but then I discovered these testimonies. I mean, discovered they're all published, but mostly ignored. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. Then I continued my research. I'm still keeping up my research right now. I am right now working on 2, even probably 3 articles on the famine. So the first one is going to be a more descriptive study of children's experiences. The second one, which I am mostly going to talk about today, is about making sense of this catastrophe, how people experienced and remembered. And the third one will be a continuation of the second one. Let me. I think I can just skip this part because probably everyone here is more or less familiar with the Kazakh famine, the main points in Kazakh famine. So basically, let me just briefly touch the experiences of children. Then I will continue with testimonies and how they can help us understand, how they can help us provide a new perspective into this catastrophe. So actually, everyone who has read something about the Kazakh famine knows how terrible, how catastrophic it was for children. Even if you are only familiar with Traruskulov's famous letter to Stalin, he has a very, I think, one of the most important descriptions, one of the most accurate descriptions of the famine. And he says in that letter that many Atkochevniki refugees, Kazakh refugees, were leaving their children to the mercy of fate. So children were being abandoned in city centers, train stations. So many children were dying in death domes, in orphanages. And he wrote that the catastrophe was so great that children faced total extinction. Therefore, children were number one victims of this famine actually, as it is always in great famines in all parts of the world. And all histories, all historians who have conducted research, who have written about famine, they somehow included stories of children into their studies, their books, their articles. But I'm going to discuss their experiences more directly. I'm not only interested in here statistical information. I'm more interested in providing an insight into their lived experience. So I have some descriptions. I have a few descriptions of children on the street, children in that terms, memoirs from children who, for example, who themselves witnessed the death of their siblings, who even put their siblings into graves themselves. But this is more about that descriptive part. Now I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus on these testimonies. So, Kazakh historians opened the path for the study of famine in the late 1980s, as probably most of the people here know. So the first studies came in 1989. Throughout the 1990s, a lot of books, a lot of studies were published by Kazakh local historians Then foreign historians started to contribute to the study of famine starting from 2000s. However, there is most of the studies by Kazakh historians, they are almost exclusively political and economic histories. They mostly discuss the same issues, the economic catastrophe, the number of deaths, statistics. So what Kazakh politicians, Kazakh intellectuals did in this time of crisis, demographic consequences of the famine, and the official resolutions, official policies of the Soviet regime. These are the main themes that Kazakh historians discuss. Very rarely they of course they include stories about children, stories about cannibalism, stories about different issues, but they haven't too much elaborated on them. In comparison, in contrast, we now have a number of good studies on specific themes in the Ukrainian famine. So we have an increasing number of studies on gender, for example, in the Ukrainian case, and we don't have any study on gender in the Kazakh case yet. So there are direct studies on cannibalism in Ukrainian case. There is one dissertation directly solely written on perpetrators of the famine, for example, in the Ukrainian case. There are a lot of studies right now, not only conducted by historians but also other scholars on trauma of the Ukrainian famine also. So we lack this kind of studies in the Kazakh famine. Although foreign historians they provided significant social histories. They discussed, for example, survival strategies. They discussed in detail survival strategies. So some themes have been researched, but there is a lot more to do on the Kazakh case. For example, the fate of Atkochevniki Kazakh refugees, particularly in Siberia, is relatively well researched because we have so many documents from Siberian authorities, but there are a lot. Still, there are a lot of themes that haven't attracted any attention. And when I first came to Kazakhstan, I was not aware of all these famine testimonies because I used to think that Muhammad Shaykhmetov's famous book is the only testimony, only memoir of this famine, because there is this kind. There is a myth in the literature actually. If you read the famine literature, you explicitly or inexplicitly, many authors, many historians said that there are no witnesses, no personal accounts of Kazakh famine, or better to say, there are only few witnesses, few personal accounts of the Kazakh famine. However, there are actually hundreds of witnesses, hundreds of famine testimonies. Some of them are book length. I mean, just two of them are book length. One of them is Muhammad Shaykhmetov. One of them here you see Baghdad Chandosay's book, Shoshkanov Kumu. It is as important as Muhammad Shaykhmetov's book, for example, but nobody is aware of it. Even the National Library doesn't have a copy. The Academy of Sciences Library doesn't have a copy. His granddaughter was my friend, and accidentally I learned about the book. I interviewed his daughter, who unfortunately passed away last year. So they gave me the book. And many other testimony collections, many other books are just ignored, both within Kazakhstan and within Western academia. Actually, a few of the listeners know about how I have been trying to find one collection which just doesn't exist. I don't know. No library has a copy. Nobody has a copy. So it also shows. It is also connected to what I'm going to discuss in my other article, the third article. I'm going to connect this to the weakness of trauma in the Kazakh case. So somehow repression of trauma during the Soviet era was somehow successful, and people, the current generation, are not really that interested in these stories, and they are just ignored ignored within Kazakhstan, also in academia. So that there are a few testimonies available in English, like Muhammad Shahmatov, and also Nurziya Kajibayev's memoirs was published in a journal. There are some available in Russian, most importantly, Valery Mikhailov's 1990 book, Хроника Великого Juta, included a number of testimonies with Kazakh writers and academics. But 90% of these sources are in Kazakh. That's probably the main reason why historians have ignored this. Even local historians, they publish these sources, they republish these sources, but they very rarely include them into their studies of the famine. Usually they have their main structure of the book, and then in a few pages they write, oh, now let's turn to the famine testimonies. So what do the witnesses say about how terrible it was? Even local historians are usually not aware of all these testimonies. But what can be learned from these famine testimonies? Of course, so testimonies, oral histories, or memoirs, they always have their own problems, but all sources have their own problems, of course. However, I argue that Kazakh famine testimonies are relatively more reliable sources, because there is no Kazakh famine has not turned into a kind of national ideology or part of national ideology. So these testimonies, at least the ones published in the 1990s, they were not influenced by a dominant by a dominant discourse, by a dominant national discourse, unlike the Ukrainian case, for example. And there are no very commonly known stories of the famine in Kazakhstan. So Shah Ahmetov's memoirs is kind of the most famous Kazakh memoir in the world, because it's available in English, but within Kazakhstan it doesn't have such a reputation, actually. Probably this book, Kızıldar Kırgını, here, it is the most widely known collection of famine testimonies within Kazakhstan. Muhammad Shah Ahmetov, even Shah Ahmetov is not a dominant narrative. His narrative is not dominant within Kazakhstan. So these testimonies haven't been influenced by either a national ideology or a dominant, widely read account of the famine. So these are advantages of Kazakh famine testimonies, I think. So these testimonies provide us a new perspective, actually. So this is my study is the first cultural history of the famine. Although there are a lot of political, economic, and social histories of the famine, this is the first cultural history of the famine. What do I mean by cultural history? I am primarily interested in how people experienced this famine and how they remember, but not only memory. It's not only memory. I am really trying to understand the experience of starvation itself. And these are the themes that I am working on right now, based on these testimonies. The collapse of all social norms, gendering the famine, and making sense of catastrophe. These three are part of this presentation, and the second article that I am working on. As I said, I am working on 3 articles. The last four here are parts of are going to be parts of my 3rd article, hopefully. Survival strategies, they help us understand also people's survival strategies, how they perceived others. This is an important theme. By others, I mean non-Kazakhs, how they perceived Russians, Uzbeks, others. What do they think about causes of the catastrophe? Of course, this doesn't mean that what they think are the real causes of the famine, but it is important to understand what these survivors think about the causes of the catastrophe. And lastly, I'm going to discuss in that last article, I'm going to discuss why commemoration of the Kazakh famine is strikingly different from the Ukrainian case. So it is probably, you may know that it is to a great extent explained only by contemporary politics. So Kazakhstan has good relations with Russia, so therefore there's no powerful commemoration of the famine in Kazakhstan. Or Kazakhstan has a large Russian minority, therefore Kazakhstan is different from Ukraine. That is definitely true. I'm not saying it is not true, but that is not sufficient. So these famine testimonies also provide another perspective on this issue. So let me start with the collapse of society. So this is rather a shorter section in my in my article. So in literary depictions, I have been also reading novels and stories. Not a comprehensive. I don't have a comprehensive literary coverage, to be honest. But I have been reading like 5 to 10 literary depictions of this famine, and in each of them, there is one very strong myth that is included in each literary depiction of the famine. The myth that Kazakhs always helped each other. Kazakhs always helped others, even when they were starving to death. They always helped each other. This is in one literary depiction. This is mostly a family story. In another famine literary depiction, this is mostly a friendship story. In another one, it is different, but always they help each other. Solidarity, Kazakh solidarity is always at the center. And these perceptions of others, I'm going to discuss perceptions of others in my third article, but this is also related to that point, because when you start with this myth that Kazakhs always helped each other, some people also agitate, some people also exploit this issue by arguing that only Kazakhs helped each other, and non-Kazakhs, Russians or others, always discriminated against Kazakh if they did not directly kill them, or if they did not directly beat them. You can see this myth, for example, in the introduction of this book, Sarı Kitap. This is a collection of memoirs written from 89 to 94, actually. So there is no new testimony in this book, but in the introduction, the author explicitly emphasizes this myth that Kazakhs survived only thanks to Kazakhs, and others always were against Kazakhs. This is a myth. We know this from testimonies, and I think this myth is going to be exploited more and more in the country. So it is important as a scholar to deconstruct this myth, actually. In the testimonies, on the other hand, most of the survivors make it very explicit that nobody really helped suffering and dying little children or other people. This is a common phrase in testimonies. It was a time when nobody cared about anyone. So child abandonment, infanticide, these were common as usually in famines, and even the family collapsed. Actually, people, as I'm going to discuss in other sections, people even, there are some testimonies, of course, in which people emphasize family ties, like Muhammad Shah Ahmedov's memoirs. But as far as I understand, I'm still thinking about this. As far as I understand, there was a critical moment of starvation. People who helped each other, people who helped others, were not really starving at that point. Only at that point they really showed some kind of solidarity. People who really experienced starved, they really did not care about anyone. So gendering the famine, this is an important section, because this is, as I said, the first gender perspective on Kazakh famine. I have 4 main questions here, although the last one is the most important one for me. So the first question is the leading role of women in collectivization protests. So if you are familiar with Lynn Viola's article, Babi Buntu, I can't remember the exact title, like women protests during the collectivization. This is a very famous article right now. So basically, we know that from Viola's studies, we know that women played a leading role in collectivization protests, in collectivization rebellions, and also authorities treated these women as not as political actors, but as irrational, hysteric women. So their reaction to these women was also, we can say, lighter in comparison to their reaction to males. So this was also a reason why women were so active in protests. So do we have the same case in the Kazakh famine? This is one of my questions. The second, and also Ukrainian historians also confront Viola's argument, by the way. They also argue that this was true for the Ukrainian famine too. Women played a leading role. The second question is the central role of mothers in the absence of fathers. This is, again, there are Ukrainian historians of gender. They focus on this issue too. Prostitution, rape, and forced sex relations. And the last one is sales and sacrifices of females and some preference. So did Kazakh women play a major role in collectivization protests? Isabelle Ohayon, a French historian of Kazakh Famine, she wrote that yes, they played. Actually, she has a few examples. She has a few archival documents, and based on them, she claims that yes, this was the same in Kazakhstan. On the other hand, Nicola Piangiola and Jarasov, in a recent article, they claimed that no, this was not the case in Kazakhstan. But this issue in general is very, very much understudied, and I'm not going to resolve this issue totally too. I'm not doing an archival, really doing an archival research on this. The truth is, my perspective is that the truth is somewhere in between probably, but I'm closer to Piangiola and Jarasov. We have some documents. I have found some documents where authorities emphasize the leading role of Kazakh women, but we have a limited number of documents. It's not like we have tens of documents talking about this issue. And on the other hand, famine testimonies, they do not include any such instance. We only have a few testimonies where people remember how women were crying, shouting at activists after confiscations, but none of them really says something like, yes, there were women in the rebellions or in the protests, women were so active. We don't have such a description. And even though it might be still true, we need archival research, but even though we accept that it is true that it was the case in Kazakhstan, we really don't know the state's reaction. Did the state treated Kazakh women as irrational, non-political, hysterical women too, and they reacted them lightly, or just like they did to Slavic women? We definitely don't know this right now. The second point, so Oksana is a historian of a Ukrainian historian. She interprets adoption of children, for example, from starving families by relatives, neighbors, or mere acquaintances as a manifestation of women's mutual help. So she focuses on how mothers, how women played such a great role in saving children, and while men were mostly absent. Do we see the same in the Kazakh case? I don't really think so. I mean, there are, of course, many cases when men were absent and women played such a highly important role, but we have a lot of cases when also male relatives, fathers or other male relatives saved children, adopted children from their relatives. So this is also not very clear in the Kazakh case. Ukrainian women were raped by party bosses or had sex with them in exchange for bread. Sex crimes and prostitution were common. Sorry. This is a very important issue, but again, we need an archival research. So my argument on this is, again, I mean, my study is limited, but my perspective is, again, a bit different. First, we need to a little bit talk about these literary depictions. There is one very famous, one of the most famous famine novels, Zamanbek Shakenov's Zulmat. So in this novel, it is all about Russian men raping Kazakh women. It is all about this. They rape even dead bodies. They say things like, let the offspring of Kazakh be eaten by wolves and ravens. So it is all about rape. You don't really see even starving people. You only read about Russian soldiers, Russian activists, or Russians, always Russians, raping Kazakh women. But on the other hand, in Kazakh testimonies, there is a complete silence on forced sexual relations, rape, or prostitution. There's not even one reference to anything like that. There's only one note in a diary note. There's only one case in a diary note. Fatima Gabutova, who was a famous cultural figure in Kazakhstan, an ethnic Tatar, but a very influential figure in Kazakhstan. She had a diary note. In that diary note, she met a mother who sent her daughters to the city bazaar for prostitution. That's the only example. So did we not have forced sex relations or rape, cases of rape in the Kazakh case? We have. So Robert Kindler's book has some references to instances of rape, but that's the only secondary source I could find discussing rape. And we have some sources in which there are descriptions like activists, most activists come to these women, they disturb them, they tease them. However, in almost all of them, they ask them to marry them instead of just raping them, or instead of women prostituting themselves, they ask women to marry them as second wives, third wives. So this is still a bit different. And I mean, female testimonies are always silent on this issue. It is not unique to Kazakhstan. So cultural explanation is, of course, important here. But Ukrainian testimonies, most of them are also silent on this issue. Or there are studies on Holocaust survivor women. So Holocaust survivors are also mostly silent on this issue. But on the other hand, testimonies in each case, in the Holocaust or in the Ukrainian famine, again, testimonies are the most important sources. Even though majority of testimonies are silent on this, still what we know about this come mostly from testimonies. So my interpretation is that cultural explanation, cultural taboos is important, of course. Probably many Kazakh women are silent on this issue for cultural reasons. But on the other hand, I think that since Kazakhs were nomads, they moved across Kazakhstan much more than Ukrainians did. The states had relatively weak control over Kazakhstan. There was probably less interaction between state officials and Kazakhs after confiscations, after debaization. That also partially explains why forced sex crimes, forced sexual relations are so rarely addressed in the Kazakh case. So for me, more important is what is called some preference in history of famines, in history of global history of famines. So although primarily about adult women, you may know that it is now widely accepted that females have a certain advantage in comparison to males in cases of starvation. Almost in all cases, males have higher mortality rates. This is mostly explained by biological reasons, but some people argue against them. They also include some other reasons. But whatever the reason is, it is a fact that women's female mortality rate is lower than male mortality rate in case of malnutrition. However, cultural norms affect mortality rates as well. I argue that social and cultural norms in times of catastrophes undermined this female mortality advantage in the Kazakh famine. Particularly little girls and young women suffered much more than males. So that is not specific to Kazakhstan. This is called some preference, especially when it comes to children. When we think about children, it's called some preference in literature. It is seen in many parts of the world, but not everywhere. But in the Kazakh case, it is very obvious indeed. So depending on demographic evidence, Makash, Tatimov, and Aliyev, in their book Der Bestimiz Demografya'da, they already argued that during the famine, families preferred to feed their sons at the expense of their daughters. And you can see that in 1959, for example, there were 1,092 males for 1,000 females from the female generation. So this is also demographically proven. I provide further evidence for some preference from archival documents, from archival sources on orphanages. So in each case, almost in each case, the proportion of girls decrease as the proportion of Kazakhs increase. I have a few examples here. So I'm trying to also support this argument by some by some archival evidence. In each case, if we have more Kazakhs, we have much more girls in orphanages after the not only during the famine, but from 1933 to, let's say, late 1930s actually. But more importantly, I'm again depending on famine testimonies. Again, we need to think about literary representations. Literary representations usually downplay this gender aspect, and memoirs like Mehmet Volkan also. So they say, yes, women suffered so much. They had to marry young women, young beautiful women, had to marry these old men, rich men. But there's no subject in their description. In each case, they imply that it was because of the conditions. It was only because of the conditions these women were sold or were forced to marry unvaluable men. However, other famine testimonies very clearly suggest that the majority of these women were sold by men for food, usually for just a kilogram of flour or something similar. But I don't know any example of a son being sold, for example. Always daughters are being sold, and wives, sometimes wives are being sold. I have only few examples here, but there are a lot of other examples. And also residents of Karakalpakistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, they also remember these Kazakhs selling their daughters and wives. I have this information from some secondary sources. Why was that so? So the main reason was the patriarchal system in Kazakh society, actually, because daughters were considered worthless in comparison to sons. Having no son marked the end of the lineage in the nomadic society. For that reason, having no son was barely better than having no children. So if you have 10 children but no son, you are barely better than a couple who has no children at all. A son is much more important. So this was the main motivation, the main behind this story actually. And it was not only sales of women, females. There were also cases when wolves attacked. So some of you may know the story of Mehmet Volkan. It is one of the most famous famine reminiscences actually, and it is also depicted in the recent movie The Crying Steppe. So when wolves attack, they left their daughters or wives to the wolves in order to gain time to escape. So Mehmet Volkan's case is a very good example, and it was the starting point for my research actually. But there are also other testimonies for this. And not only wolves, but when they had to choose, they chose to parents. When parents had to choose, not only fathers, by the way, also mothers, they chose to save their sons and sacrifice their daughters. Because by saving sons, many testimonies talk about this. I wouldn't say many, but at least we have more than a few descriptions. So they were trying to save their lineage. That was the main motivation. If you save a son, you can save your lineage. So Zira Nauruzbayeva has a very interesting piece actually, Devouchka Peska. This was also very important for me. Then when I read this story, then I started thinking more on this issue. In that story too, a mother with three sons and one daughter. She was, if I'm not wrong, in Western Kazakhstan. She was traveling in the steppe. She understood that she couldn't save all her children, and she preferred to save her three sons, and just left her daughter behind. Not just left, and poured some sand on her actually, so she could not move. She could not follow her. So the little daughter was left there to death. That's an but we also have other cases like Azilhan Nurshaykov's memoirs. I forgot to mention this actually at the beginning when I talked about sources. There are also many memoirs like life stories from childhood to their old age that include reminiscences of famines. And as far as I know, very few people are aware of this. There are many memoirs like that. Azilhan Nurshaykov, a war veteran and a very famous writer, he's a good example. Kemal Tokayev actually has a book about his father, Slova Abatse. It's in two languages, Russian and Kazakh. Kasım-Jomart Tokayev has a book about his father, Kemal Tokayev. That also includes a lot of interesting stuff on famine. There are Süleyman Bekenov, Rafika Nurtazina. There are many examples of this. Kasım Tavkenov. So I'm also incorporating many of these sources actually, whatever I can find. So in Azilhan Nurshaykov's case, for example, his sister was not left to death, but even though his sister was in worse condition, his father preferred to give Azilhan to a relative, and he said something like, "Whatever happens to us, let it happen. Just save this son." But his daughter was almost dying, and he saved his son. So another important section of the article is making sense of catastrophe section. In this section, I discuss which images dominate Kazakh survivors' accounts, how they understood. How many minutes do I have, by the way? Excuse me.
I think that you have another 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes to finish.
Okay, I should be very quick then. So in the literature on famines, there is a widely accepted argument. There is a widespread argument that famines are feminized through images of passive suffering of women. So there's a whole theoretical discussion about this. This book is the most important book on this issue, The Feminization of Famine by Margaret Kelleher. It's about the Irish famine, but there are other good studies about these different aspects of feminization. There's a very good study on late 19th century famines in China, Tears from Iron. It's a very good cultural history. It's also a model for me actually. So in many cases in the literature, scholars mainly agree that famines are feminized. So I'm not going into details of this theoretical discussion. In the Kazakh case, I talked about this book. Zamanbek Shakanov's Zulmat is a very good example. However, his book doesn't really discuss starving women. His book is all about national hatred of Russians towards Kazakhs, and it doesn't really discuss. It is not really feminizing starvation or famine itself. It's feminizing all this story of destruction of Kazakh nation by Russians. In contrast, women's bodies never symbolize the Kazakh nation in survivors' accounts. And based on these Kazakh famine testimonies, I argue that surviving victims of the famine primarily understood what they endured, not through images of desperate women, but through images of starving and dead children. And we need to question the universality of that argument I'm suggesting. So I have decided there are four major images emerging from these testimonies. The first one is a clog of dead bodies on the roads, both in the rural areas and in city centers. This is very common in many testimonies. Many people had to walk through these dead bodies. So some of them were just freezed. They were in shock. Some started crying. Some were hysteric. So there are many descriptions of this. The second one is an infant trying to suck his or her dead mother's breast. That is an image which is also very important for Margaret Kelleher. The third one is a pile of child corpses taken from an orphanage by a cart to a desolate place. That's very important. This image of cart is very, very dominant. And child victims of cannibalism stories. So three of these four images are directly about children, although cannibalism stories, of course, include also stories of adults, not only children. So the image of a dead woman with a still living infant at her breast is probably a universal image of famines. We have a lot of such images in Ukraine too, in China, in other cases, and we have very emotional responses to such images in testimonies. I mean, people see hundreds of dead bodies, they get used to it, but they just start hysterically crying when they see such an image. We have descriptions of this. According to Kelleher, a woman's dry breast represents one of the deepest horrors in a famine. The waning female body represents the source of life. However, I prefer to read it primarily in reference to children, little infants, because I have cases, I have testimonies which directly focus people. These survivors are obviously more interested in the fate of the infant rather than the dead female body. So I don't have too much time. I'm not going into details. The pile of a cart, an image of a cart, it is very important. In many testimonies, the high numbers of deaths in orphanages is associated with the image of a cart. People remember such image. So many people say, up to this day, even in my old age, those images haunt me. I cannot remember the legs or arms of that child corpses on that cart. And this type of we have a lot of this type of descriptions. We have testimonies from children themselves, children living in dead homes, from people who lived close to an orphanage, and from people who worked transporting child corpses, who wrote these cards. And cannibalism. Let's make this okay. Cannibalism. It is very interesting that cannibalism stories are so dominant in Kazakh famine testimonies. I mean, I have been reading so many Kazakh testimonies, but I am still surprised, because I used to say that probably half of Kazakh testimonies include a reference to either a detailed description, an eyewitness account, or a hearsay about cannibalism, but it is probably more. I mean, in some collections, almost all testimonies talk about cannibalism. So what is interesting about that? The interesting part is that it is not that cannibalism occurred in Kazakhstan. It occurred everywhere in all great famines. There is nothing specific about Kazakhstan. Cannibalism happened everywhere. However, in many cases, it turned into a kind of taboo, a matter of national honor. So people, for example, this is argued for the Irish famine. So, this is also, there is an argument about Ukrainian diaspora. They tried to hide these stories because they were ashamed of these stories. So it became a taboo. Although we have Ukrainian testimonies that also discuss cannibalism, I wouldn't say that there are no descriptions in Ukrainian testimonies, but Ukrainian diaspora in literature, in film, they downplayed this story. In the Kazakh case, on the other hand, it is so open. It is everywhere. So if you have watched this recent movie, The Crying Step, there are, if I remember correctly, there are 3 or 4 scenes of cannibalism, and one of them was even very, very caricaturized, a very caricaturized depiction of cannibalism, very inaccurate. But why are Kazakh testimonies so open on cannibalism? That's not the case in other parts of the world, although there are some, of course, similarities with some other cases. Most importantly, with China, there are some similarities. But the phrase that it was a period when father ate his own child is repeated in numerous testimonies as a way to describe the calamity that Kazakh people experienced. So that's important. But I'm also arguing that this is so because that this image is so dominant because famine has not turned into a national ideology in Kazakhstan. It has not turned into a taboo because it is not a national ideology, and people, survivors, can be more open. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that each and every person talking about cannibalism really witnessed cannibalism. It doesn't mean that each and every case is true. There are very fantastic descriptions too. However, it has become a way to emphasize that how much Kazakhs suffered. So it is probably the number one image right now to tell the rest of the world how great the suffering, how great the catastrophe was in Kazakhstan. But on the other hand, we cannot just ignore all these cannibalism testimonies, because many people directly say that they witnessed these cannibalism stories, and we even have a few testimonies from cannibals themselves. I mean, they don't say that they killed people and ate them, but they were given food by some other woman, usually a woman, but by a woman they ate it. They ate meat, and they later learned that it was actually human meat. So some historians also tend to dismiss these cannibalism stories, and they only treat it as a linguistic, or how can I say, as a cultural construct, as an image. But it is not it is not true. We also should give credit to people. They remember this because this happened, and it is documented actually. If you read any histories of Kazakh Famine, Nikolai Piangiola or Robert Kindler, or in Kazakhstan, Burkitbay Ayagan's book, 2012 book, has a lot of references to cannibalism. It is also documented, of course. So why do children occupy such a central role in Kazakh testimonies? The simple fact is that children represent the future of any society. Therefore, this is my conclusion, kind of. Images of starving and dying children represent the lack of any hope for the future of Kazakh society. And all these testimonies actually prove that collapse brought by the famine was much deeper than a demographic crisis. And that is why we need to look beyond physical devastation and see the role of symbolic collapse of a whole society. Also, for example, we know almost nothing about post-famine era, how these people coped with their suffering, how these people coped with trauma, how they again were reintegrated into society. I mean, there are social histories discussing social organization, like Robert Kindler discusses this in detail, how society is, and Isabel Orhayan is also discussing lineage, how lineage survived. But I mean, in the individual level, in terms of lived experience, we really don't know how these people continued their lives. So I have another chapter about dead tombs of orphans of the famine in the post-famine era, and I'm trying to discuss this a little bit, but we need to study more. That is the end. I have 2 more slides, but those are about the third article I mentioned. So if you have any questions, I'm just showing them. I can answer questions about them too. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. That was very interesting. And I forgot to tell you that, in fact, this week in History of Kazakhstan, the students are studying the famine. And we read, many of the audience members, in fact, will have read this document collection from Taldik Kurgan. And many of the images you just mentioned came up, actually. All the infant sucking on the dead mother's breast, the people carrying bodies. So these things are all in everyone's mind already, unfortunately. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I see already we have a hand. There are 2 ways to ask questions. You can ask a question in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I will allow you to talk. So I already have 2 questions, and I'm just going to allow those people to talk. So Ulan first, and then Claire, and then we'll move from there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Mehmet. Thank you very much. We're friends on Facebook, and I really like your article on street renaming. It's included into my syllabus, and students are reading your article. I will be glad to talk with you maybe later. So in 10 minutes, I have some other Zoom. So my question is about survival strategies. I mean, it's based on my fieldwork in Pavlodar Oblast and in Saragash, or let's say on Siberian border and southern border. And after reading also Kızıldar Kırgını, which I helped to translate to Sarah Cameron in Washington, D.C., So during my PhD program, I've got sense that frontier area, I mean, if you call them frontier areas, right? South and north, they had more opportunities to survive. As I understood, the strategy of people in Pavlodar region was to leave and go to Omsk, to the West Siberia. From people of Saragash, from elders, I heard that the strategy during famine was to go to territory of modern Uzbekistan. But from Kızıldar Kırgını book, I've got sense that people, let's say from, and it's actually from memories of my family who from northern Kazakhstan, from Akhmola region, Akhmola and let's say areas of Zhanarkha, central Kazakhstan, Karaganda areas, they kind of like, mainland of Kazakh land. So it was really hard to reach areas where food was, let's say like Omsk border or Tashkent border, right? So just because of geographical locations, I mean, if you don't have transportation, if all your livestock confiscated, like, I don't know, bulls, oxes, horses, camels, practically you should walk this 800,000 kilometers, which is practically almost impossible for staff people. And I think that's one of the maybe reasons that the casualties of famine were, my impression, I don't know statistic, but like, let's say the more nomadic areas, central areas suffered really heavy. Then they just don't have enough like survival options in comparison with frontier areas.
Should I answer, or are we gonna take other questions?
Yeah, if you
Okay.
Go ahead and answer.
So you are right. What you said is almost totally right. I mean, mobility is the #1 survival strategy for Kazakhs. That's Robert Kindler discusses it at length, actually. Other historians have discussed survival strategies. I'm probably not saying anything quite new on this issue, and I'm not focusing on mobility because it is widely known right now, and it has been studied by other historians. But you are right, mobility was #1 survival strategy in eastern Kazakhstan, in northern Kazakhstan. I am looking at other survival strategies, like people, for example, I right now know how you can hunt a rat, for example, or how you can collect wild birds' eggs. So I'm looking at these survival strategies. One very interesting example is fishing. Although many Kazakhs who were close to lakes or rivers survived thanks to available fish. However, it is very interesting that there are at least 5 to 10, maybe even more than 10 cases when testimonies which say that some Kazakhs thought fish was forbidden in Islam, haram. Fish was forbidden by mullahs, and some Kazakhs did not eat fish even when they were starving. Bağdat Jandosay, the book I showed, has a very good example, for example. And many Kazakhs did not know how to fish, how to catch fish. So I'm trying to understand these other aspects. Mobility is definitely most important, and also agriculture. If Kazakhs, people who were engaged in agriculture in somehow they had other options. I had one very interesting testimony, actually. You know about the Dungan pogrom last year. We have a testimony from exactly the same region, which says that Kazakhs there survived thanks to Dungans, because they learned how to cultivate land from Dungans, exactly from the same village, not even from just Kurlay, Karakemer, exactly from that same region. So I'm talking more about these issues, both how they survived and both how they couldn't survive. That's also important, like in the question of fish, for example. And there were, and this is also directly related to their perceptions of others. That is more important for me. How other people, non-Kazakhs, I mean, did they help them? They remember them with gratitude, or there are very anti-Uzbek testimonies, for example. But there are also many testimonies which says Uzbeks helped them survive. I don't know if this was really an answer for your question, but as I said, mobility, it is. I definitely agree, but I am I'm discussing it less, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, and testimonies about Uzbeks interested in Saragash from one imam who passed away from coronavirus. I heard, like, it's back to your point about prostitution. Actually, he mentioned that during the famine, Kazakhs, our grandmothers were going and becoming like mistresses of Uzbeks just for bread. I mean, he didn't openly say like they were raped or they become prostitutes, but he just mentioned it, you know. There is still like a trauma, I mean, and people don't want to emphasize it a lot.
Yeah, but this is always represented as sale of women. So they were sold. They were not really raped, but they were sold by men.
Yeah,
that's the thing. If you have that source, if you can send it to me, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. It was oral testimony. Okay. Thank you. I should leave. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for a great session, and let's talk later. Yeah.
Okay, Claire, I think.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. So I want to, so first of all, it's interesting that you're taking on these incredibly difficult and important topics. So things which are important historically, but also important today, various of the things we're talking about here. And I wanted to go back to this issue of sexual violence, and I would certainly include this kind of coercive sex in sexual violence. And I think here, if we think about the recent trend viewing the Soviet Union as an empire, I think there's some potential way forward here, because if we put it in that terms, if you have coercive sexual relationship between indigenous Central Asian women and white Russian Bolshevik party officials, that's then in a particular framework of colonial sexual violence and something that's been studied a lot. And so certainly, so British India, relationships between European invaders and Native American women and African American slaves. And one thing that's been done there with those studies is to find memoirs of the men and read those memoirs against the intention of the actual author. So you've told us a lot about memoirs by Kazakh survivors of the famine. Do we have memoirs by party officials? And what kind of things would those tell us?
Thank you very much. I definitely see it as a coercive violence, as a case of coercive violence, but I emphasize the role of males. So it is not males who sold this woman. It's not just other men came and coerced this woman to sex. It is rather their either their fathers or their husbands agreed and sold them first. Secondly, actually, in none of these cases, I don't remember any case when these women were sold to Russians. It is Russians very rarely appear in Kazakh accounts, actually, as in this survivor accounts. That is an issue I'm going to talk in my third article, hopefully. They are either sold to other Kazakhs or to Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, to the Chinese in China, to Karakalpaks in Karakalpakistan. And when people remember perpetrators, government workers, this image of activists, belsendiler in Kazakh, belsendiler is so dominant. Everyone remembers these belsendiler, and they are almost always Kazakhs themselves. That is also a difference. I'm going to discuss this and in the third article, and I'm going to tie it to the point why Kazakh famine is commemorated differently from the Ukrainian case. Because in the Ukrainian case, for example, we know that people confused their fellow Ukrainians with Russians because they were speaking Russian, and they couldn't understand if they were Ukrainians or Russians, and they thought they were Russians coming from abroad. Or even in Kuban, many people, there are studies on this. Many people thought that these activist people who were confiscating them were non-Russians, others, basically others, people from Caucasus, people from other parts. In the Kazakh case, it's so clear, it's always Kazakhs themselves. And for that reason, that novel, Zulmat, is so in opposition, so in contrast to all famine testimonies. I have no example of Russian men raping Kazakh women. There are cases of activists coming and teasing women and forcing them to marry them. Those accounts, I guess, include a few cases of Russians, but it is definitely not dominant. So that is not the case in the Kazakh famine, basically. Still, I'm working on this. What was your last point? Perpetrators, activists' memoirs. We have a few. But very brief descriptions. One Kazakh party member, Shafik Chokin, very brief description. He basically claims they believed in everything party said. So this is also discussed in literature, how perpetrators claim to try to justify themselves, claim that they believed in everything. That's a defense mechanism they use. There are a few testimonies from like Komsomol members or other activists, but they also claim that they took part with people later. So we don't. That issue is very important. These activists, perpetrators, we really need a more direct study on this. As I said, there's a dissertation on this in the Ukrainian case right now. I am mostly going to contribute how survivors understood what they remember about these perpetrators, but someone should really study this in more details in a more systematic way. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question from Nicolo. I'm going to bring him in, and I'm going to
Hello, do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Mehmet, for this wonderful presentation and for your very important research. I have a question. Well, first of all, I would like that you say something about the second last slide about how people made sense of the famine. So to answer your own question, so to speak. And then I have a question about these memoirs. So what is your sense about how much the memory of the famine was present within families, within Kazakh families after the famine? In other words, are these memoirs almost all of them things that came out with perestroika, and so people started to speak also within families and to publish their memoirs, or in any case, the memory of the famine is something that was kept within families, was common to have it within families in Kazakhstan?
Thank you. That's actually a very good question, because I think that's a very important question. That's also related to my point that we really don't know how these people coped with trauma after the famine. Most of these memoirs, all of them were published after 1989. The earliest one was 1989. Gali Mahmedov's memoir in the journal Julduz was the first one. And some people actually, especially later, memoirs published later in the last decade, they publish what they heard from their parents or sometimes their grandparents. But in the 1990s, most of these memoirs were written by survivors themselves. In some of them, we have a sense that some of these memoirs were first retold within family during the Soviet era. Some of them were even written down during the Soviet era and published later, but they are a minority. To a great extent, that is one of the things I would like to discuss more in my further research, not now. I think basically my assumption is that repression of memory of the famine was more or less successful. I mean, parents, most of them did not tell anything about the famine to their children. And for that reason, I'm trying to tie it to the contemporary memory of the famine. That is one of the main reasons why famine memory, famine commemoration is not very important in Kazakhstan. So I have one case, for example, maybe just to give a concrete example. One father or mother, I can't remember, was telling about famine to his or her children during the Soviet era, and children never listened to him, never believed him. Then after 1989, they heard all these about famine, and they came to their father or mother, father probably, and said that, "Oh, father, what you told us was true. We didn't know that." So there is definitely a rupture in memory, but this rupture is not in terms of survivors themselves. I mean, they always remembered this. There's a generational gap, generational rupture. It was so one way of looking at this. So there's this discussion. It just started. If Kazakh society, contemporary Kazakh society, is a traumatic society. What I see is that it is not really. But we need to study this more systematically. I don't think memory or trauma of famine is important for the current generation. But there are some hints, like, for example, mothers, parents, or grandparents tell their children to be careful with food, always respect bread. So there are this kind of indications. So we need to study this in more detail to understand how this trauma is somehow transferred to the next generations. But I now think there is definitely a rupture between generations.
I had another question, which was your question.
Which one? Can you please repeat it?
The one about survivors themselves thought about the causes of the famine.
Yeah, that's also an interesting topic. Maybe I will discuss it in the last article. First of all, they too much blame these activists. That is a very dominant image. So the main perpetrators, the main guilty, who were guilty for the famine, for survivors, primarily these Belsendis, they call them Şolak Belsendiler or Jalgan Belsendiler, Ötürk Belsendiler. They think they are the primary guilty. Then some of them blame the poor, actually. So when the Soviet government took the confiscated livestock and redistributed it to the poor, there are a number of testimonies which say that the poor just didn't know how to raise livestock. That's why they basically start. Self-blame is very interesting. I don't think this is apparent in the Ukrainian case. There is a lot of self-blame. Many Kazakhs say, if only we knew how to grow potatoes, if only we knew how to fish, how to catch fish. So Russians, they grew potatoes, they knew agriculture, and they survived. We starved because we didn't know this. We starved because we only knew to live with livestock. We didn't know even hunting birds in some testimonies. That is also important. So I'm going to focus on these themes in that section, but I'm still working on that section. If I don't know if this is a good response to your question.
Thank you so much.
And also, of course, this perception of others is also related to this issue. I mean, how they understood. What I emphasize here is also that in the Ukrainian case, the image of the other is mostly Russians. Although there were also Jews and Germans, we have a few studies on them, but mostly Russians were the others. In the Kazakh case, there were many others. So not only Russians, but there were also Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Karakalpaks, Dungans, Chinese, Uyghurs. There were many others. This is also, I think, this is also a difference between the Ukrainian and Kazakh case, and I'm hoping to discuss it also and tie it to this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I just want to say quickly to everyone out there that we are recording this lecture. It will be on the History of Kazakhstan website. In terms of wider publicity, that will be something we'll have to discuss privately, but if it does become that case, then we'll let everybody know. There are two questions in the Q&A that Janer K says, thank you for the lecture. What can you say about statistics? Do you think the statistics were accurate or there were distortions? And can we consider Holodomor as a genocide of Kazakhs? Well, that's going to be a complicated question. Nowadays, many people consider it wasn't organized famine, but collectivization, agricultural reformations were organized. So can we consider this famine was also organized as an organized famine? Because we know in Uzbekistan, the situation was normal and many Kazakhs survived. So that's Janer K's question.
Okay, thank you. Both of these questions are very important, but unfortunately, I'm not the person who can respond to these questions. I do not really consider myself as a historian of famine. I'm rather working on people's perceptions, lived experience. Not only during the famine, I'm also working on wartime accounts, personal accounts, Kazakh soldiers' accounts, for example. So statistics, yeah, you should ask this question to Nicola, not to me, actually. And genocide, I'm not really discussing it, whether this is genocide or not. It is a different question, but I'm trying to understand the suffering itself. Whether it is genocide or isn't genocide, it is not really that important to me personally. I try to understand lived experience, memory, meaning. I try to understand these questions. Thank you.
Okay, another question from Janar. She says, I have a clarification question. You mentioned that in Kazakhstan, the famine has not turned into national ideology. What do you mean? Could you please elaborate on this?
I mean, mostly the comparison case is mostly Ukraine. In Ukraine, the famine is a very significant part of the official discourse right now. You can see commemoration of famine across the country. There are countless museums, memorials. There have been so many initiatives. So in my talk, for example, I said there is a myth that there are no personal accounts, witnesses of Kazakh famine. This is usually claimed in comparison to Ukraine, because in Ukraine there were very systematic campaigns to collect famine testimonies. I said that we probably have like 300 to 400 famine testimonies right now, maybe even more in Kazakhstan. But in the Ukrainian case, it is like thousands of testimonies, maybe 4,000, 5,000 testimonies, because there have always been more systematic initiatives within Ukraine, and it is used in politics. Probably many people are aware of this. It is a very important issue in Ukraine's relations with Russia, and within Ukraine's internal politics also, regarding the Russian minority, or even not only ethnic Russian, but people whose native language is Russian. That's a huge discussion in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, what is also very important is the case of the diaspora. So the diaspora started to introduce this tragedy to the larger world in the immediate aftermath of World War II, actually. The first collection of testimonies in the Ukrainian case was in English language, was published in 1955. So they have developed and they have formed this national discourse starting from World War II, actually. And the diaspora played a huge role here. In the Kazakh case, we don't have a diaspora. And in the Kazakh case, authorities are always much more careful with this issue. Commemoration is much less visible. People are much less familiar with this issue. So, as I said, Shah Ahmetov, many foreigners think that Mohammed Shah Ahmetov is a very famous person probably in Kazakhstan, but within Kazakhstan, not many people know even Mohammed Shah Ahmetov. That is what I mean by, and there is no dominant, in the Ukrainian case, when there's a dominant national discourse, when you go to people and to collect testimonies, you hear the it is very possible that you hear the same story again and again because they are very influenced by media, by state discourse, or by dominant image. Like there are tens of feminine novels in Ukraine. There are many films. So these products, cultural products, influence people's minds, memoirs. In the Kazakh case, we don't have this. We are going to have this because I can say that testimonies collected in the last decade are a bit different. I will explain it in my paper. It is a bit changing. For example, this issue of solidarity, the myth that Kazakhs help each other, that is being repeated more and more in more recent testimonies. There are some differences, and it is going to change in Kazakhstan too, but that is what I mean in general. Thank you.
All right, we're running close to out of time. There is a comment in the chat by Simon and one more question, and I think that's going to wrap us up for today. So Simon in the chat says, in terms of cannibalism, taboos, and memory, I wondered about making a comparison with the siege of Leningrad. Anecdotally, cannibalism is a fairly prominent element of the memory of the siege, even though there are taboos associated with it. It's presented as a rare occurrence and with condemnation. This might be an interesting comparison of a context in which the topic played a significant role in the memory. So I guess it's not really so much a question as a comment, although I don't know if you have a response comment.
Thank you. I mean, I'm trying to look other cases of cannibalism stories. Leningrad, I haven't really looked into it very in details, but I'm going to. Thank you very much.
So I also allow Hannah Matt to ask a question.
Thank you. Mehmet, thank you so much for your fascinating talk today. I was wondering if in your reading of testimonies and memoirs, you had come across anyone discussing anyone trying to help people during the famine. So institutions, whether that's the state or maybe religious institutions, or organizations like the Red Cross. I know you've just shared a fantastic collection of photos about a Red Cross campaign on Twitter. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So what's exactly the question? Is there...
So if anyone discusses institutions or organizations trying to help people during the famine.
I mean, during the famine, that question is again beyond my research. Maybe you should address other historians. But in the 1930s, but this film, let me give an example. This film, the recent film, starts with an image of American Relief Organization, a caravan of American Relief Organization, and ends with American Relief Organization caravan. How it is very absurd because it didn't function in the Soviet Union after 1923, and it had no role in the Kazakh Famine. So it is there is definitely a political agenda there. The film is an Oscar nominee right now, and some historians have been emphasizing the role of American Relief Organization, but mostly for the famine of 1921-22. So you can find information on this there's a recent book by Svetlana Smogilova. I guess I can't, if I don't remember her name, sorry. Svetlana Smogilova has a recent book on the famine of 1921-22. She has a chapter on this. Other than that, I think other historians discuss famine relief and help, organizational help, but I just look at Children's Commission, how children were treated in the death tombs. I don't know too much about other issues. Sorry.
Okay, if you're not completely exhausted yet, Mehmet, there is one more question in the chat, and I think that should probably really wrap us up. And it's from Aya Orazbayeva. She says, "Thank you for this lecture. What were the difficulties in collecting primary sources on women and children? In your opinion, is there any direct evidence of Kazakh women engaging in prostitution?"
So the difficulty is, I was not aware of them. I came to Kazakhstan, I accidentally found, I don't know, probably I first found Kızıldar Kırgını or Navbet, these collections. I don't remember. I didn't know that there were other collections. I was in the library, I was looking for books on famine. The difficulty, you really cannot find many of these sources. They are not even in the libraries. It is also, as I said, related to the point how famine trauma is not really that dominant in contemporary Kazakhstan because these sources are neglected. by Kazakhs themselves. Only a few of them are a little bit known, like Kızıldar Kırgını is one of them, or Хроника Великого Жита, Valery Mikhailov's books is relatively well known, but all the others, I mean, you need to, there is no one who can, there was one Kazakh friend who helped me with some sources, but I don't know there is anyone who has a list of all the testimonies. So you just need to look at all the possible sources. For example, these memoirs, which are more like life stories, no one is aware of them, aware that they also include reminiscences of the famine. And there are probably, I have right now probably more than 10 of them. Some of them are war veterans. I was reading war veterans memoirs, and I saw that they discuss famine in 10 pages, 5 pages, 15 pages, but they are valuable. And prostitution, I guess I explained it a little bit. It happened everywhere. Probably it happened in Kazakhstan too, but how it was different. I'm trying to explain that it was more like sale of women rather than direct prostitution in the Kazakh case. But there are references to prostitution in Robert Kindler's book. You can check Robert Kindler's book also.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. That was an excellent talk, and clearly it provoked a lot of interest, as evidenced by the fact that Nikolai and I didn't even have a chance to ask questions. But that's okay. We appreciate that the audience was very engaged. So thank you for giving us your time, and good luck on your research.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mehmet, for a fascinating talk.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk soon.